Okay, so thank you for coming today for today's webinar on understanding and analyzing continuous glucose monitoring reports. I also want to thank Better for inviting me today to speak to you. So my name is Marie Raffray. I'm a nurse at IRCM, Institut de Recherche Clinique de Montréal. I work on Dr. Rabassa-Lore's team in type 1 diabetes. And today we're going to look at continuous glucose monitoring. So I'm going to ask you to write down your questions during the presentation in the question and answer section on the Zoom. And then at the end, at around 1:30 when we're going to end, I'm going to look over the questions and we'll answer them then. So here's a small outline of the presentation today. So first, we're going to look over some of the characteristics of continuous glucose monitoring. Then we're going to look at how to download the reports. We're going to look over the key data and recommendations on these reports. And finally, we're going to learn how to analyze the reports by looking through a few examples. So a few characteristics of continuous glucose monitoring, or CGM. So right now in Canada, we have 3 different devices that are available and on the market. So we have Freestyle Libre and Freestyle Libre 2. The Freestyle Libre is covered by the RAMQ. The version 2 is not yet covered, but will most likely be, we're hoping, soon. What's special about the Freestyle Libre is that it is a flash monitoring system where you have to take either the receiver or your phone and bring it up to your arm to connect with the sensor in order to see a glucose value. Whereas the Dexcom and Guardian 3 that is used with the Medtronic pump, these are both real-time continuous glucose monitors where you don't have to really do any intervention to see your glucose value. It is automatically on your phone or on the receiver at all time. Oh, and I forgot to say that the Dexcom is also covered by the RAMQ. So first of all, to really know how to utilize this technology, we need to understand how it works. And if we compare it to home glucose monitoring device, like glucometers, where we take a little prick of blood on our finger and we measure the direct value of the direct blood sugar level in the blood. For the continuous glucose monitoring devices, what the devices are measuring is actually the blood sugar level in the interstitial fluid, which is located just beneath the skin where you install the sensor. So knowing this, we need to acknowledge the delay of 10 to 15 minutes between the blood sugar level in the blood and the blood sugar level in the interstitial fluid. So we asked the question, is this technology of CGM, is it accurate? Can I use it for my day-to-day blood glucose monitoring? And the answer is yes. It does adhere to all of Health Canada's recommendations for blood glucose monitoring. But knowing this, I'm just going to look over a few points and factors to consider with you to best utilize this technology, taking into account how it works and the delay of 10 and 15 minutes that we have between the blood sugar level in the blood and in the interstitial fluid. So looking at some of these factors when we use CGM devices, we need to make sure that we understand that this delay can have more of an impact during periods of rapid glucose fluctuations. So when your blood sugar is changing very rapidly, so it could be during sports, exercise, when it's going low very rapidly, so during a hypoglycemic event, and even after a hypoglycemic event, when you treat a hypoglycemic event, or after a meal. These are periods where the margin of error between the measurement of a capillary blood glucose value compared to the CGM value will be greater. Also, the day the sensor is worn can have an impact on the accuracy. So we know that with most of these devices, the first 24 hours, the sensor may be slightly less precise. So we just have to take that into account. Finally, the area where the sensor is installed can also have an impact. Usually behind the arm is a little more accurate, but technically for the Dexcom, for example, it has been tested in other areas, and it's indicated as well to wear around the abdomen. Finally, the calibration of the device is very important. So this is only going to be the case for the Guardian Sensor 3. That still requires a calibration with a blood glucose measurement from a glucometer every 12 hours. So it's going to be important to calibrate the device adequately to ensure its accuracy. So now that we actually have quite a bit of experience with CGMs, they've been out for many years now. And they offer many advantages. So as clinicians, they really help us on following and adjusting therapy to optimize glycemic control. But also for the people who wear these devices, it helps them on a daily basis to reduce that burden of managing their blood glucose every day. And with the CGM technology, it gives us so much information. We have blood glucose values every 5 to 15 minutes that are recorded. How can we utilize this and how can we use it? So as I said, as clinicians, we use it in our practice daily. However, as people who use these systems, what are they doing with this data? And if we look at an Australian study where 138 people living with type 1 diabetes were surveyed, we saw that most of them reported that analyzing these reports seemed complicated and complex. Most people said that they would like to have tools to better understand how to analyze the reports. And finally, when we looked at the people who were able to analyze their reports before coming to their appointment, these people usually had lower HbA1cs and a better glycemic control. So there is an advantage of analyzing and being able to visualize our reports as patients and not only as clinicians. So now that we know that these reports are useful, how do we download them and how do we visualize them? So you can see that depending on the type of CGM, there will be a platform associated to the CGM to be able to visualize the reports. So this little table here is just a little summary, but there's a tool in Better where you can find a little bit more information. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes with you just to look at every single CGM and see how we can upload the data. So for the Dexcom, there is a mobile app on your phone called Dexcom that a lot of people use just for their daily monitoring. So this is essentially the receiver of the Dexcom where they're going to see their blood glucose levels in real time. But if you want to visualize the reports and analyze the reports, you actually have to download an additional mobile app called Clarity on your phone. And the data is automatically going to be transferred on this app and integrated into reports. Whereas if you have the Dexcom receiver, it's really going to take a cable and you're going to have to connect your receiver to your computer, create an account on Clarity on the web, in order to upload the data. For the Freestyle Libre, there's also an app on the phone, depending on the version that you have. So there's the Libre Link, and there's the Libre 2, so that you use to monitor your blood sugar on a daily basis. But if you want to visualize the reports, you're going to have to create an account on LibreView with the same username and password from your application, and automatically the data from your application is going to be transferred to the LibreView platform, and you will be able to visualize the reports. If you have the receiver, again, it's going to take a cable that you're going to have to connect the receiver and upload it on your computer to be able to visualize the reports in LibreView. And finally, with the Medtronic, with the new version that came out recently, the 770G, there is a mobile app called MiniMed that you can download on your phone, and you can see the real-time data from your pump and CGM, which is the Guardian. But if you want to visualize reports, again, you're going to have to create an account on CareLink. But the advantage is that with the mobile app, the data can be automatically transferred to the CareLink platform, so you don't have to connect your pump anymore and upload it. Whereas if you have the previous versions of the pump, you will still need to use the ContourNext Link glucometer and plug it into your computer in order to download the pump on the CareLink platform and visualize the reports. So that now that you know how to download all your reports from your CGM device, which report to choose to analyze, because there's quite a few. So today we're really going to focus on the AGP report, which is the ambulatory glucose profile report, which we use a lot in practice, but which I think is going to help you really analyze quickly how you're doing. So in order to look at these reports, it's going to be important to look at the last 14 days to analyze the data from the last 14 days. That's pretty much what we always use in the clinic, and that's going to be what's most representative to make a good analysis. Just a side note for the Medtronic, this report is not called AGP, it's called Assessment and Progress, but essentially it's going to show you the same report as the AGP. So in these reports, I'm going to go over some of the important data and information that you're going to want to look at, and also what the clinical recommendations are. So here is really the key data and recommendations. So these are a few numbers that can kind of guide you and help you. So for the first thing that you're going to look at is the percentage of time that your glucose values are in range, and then the percentage time that you spend in hypoglycemia and the percentage of time that you spend in hyperglycemia. So as far as what the guidelines recommend for from Diabetes Canada is that your time in range, the percentage of time that you want to spend in range, which means between 4 and 10 millimoles per liter, is going to be at least 70%. And then what we would like is that you spend less than 4% in hypoglycemia and less than 25% in hyperglycemia. So those are the clinical recommendations. And then the other factor that we can look at is glucose variability. And the number that we could look at for that is the coefficient of variation. And the coefficient of variation is going to be a percentage. It's going to represent the dispersion and variability of your glucose values over that 14-day time period. And what we would like is that it is less than 36%. Finally, what we also want to make sure is that when we analyze all this data is that the data is there. So make sure that when you look at these reports that the percentage of time or the percentage of recorded data that exists is at least 70%. So if there's a bunch of missing data because you didn't wear your CGM maybe, or you took it off before the time period, then it's not going to be a good report to analyze. You want at least to have 70% of the data there. Finally, another value that's of interest is the HbA1c, the estimated HbA1c, or the glucose management indicator, the GMI, which is really going to be the equivalent of a HbA1c value. So what we recommend for that, again, is 7% or less. So it should be close to what your HbA1c value is when you go and do your blood test in the lab. So those were the key, that was the key data that we look at. Now, on top of that, in the AGP is what we're going to see is a graphic. So it's going to visually give us more information, which is very interesting. So with the ambulatory glucose profile, what it's going to represent is a graph where all of your glucose values during that 14-day period of time is going to be plotted on this graph. So you have a time period from midnight to midnight, and then your glucose values on the y-axis, and it's really going to give you a spread of all of that data. And here what we want to look at is we want to draw some imaginary lines at the 4 millimole per liter range and the 10 millimole per liter range, which are going to be our targets, right? So that's where we hope, or what we're trying, is to keep all our glucose values within that range, between the 4 and 10 range. After that, there's going to be the dark blue line, which represents the median. So that's really the central point at every given time of day of your glucose data, the dispersion of your glucose data. And then there's going to be different zones, which we call the 25th to 75th percentile and the 10th to 90th percentile. So the darker blue zone is the 25th to 75th percentile, which represents 50% of your values that are in that zone and in that range. And then the 10th to 90th percentile is the larger zone, the light blue, which represents 80% of your values. So how do we analyze this? So our objective today is to give you a tool that's going to help you analyze the AGP report. So the way that we break it down is in 3 steps. So the first step is when we look at our AGP report, we're going to check if we have any hypoglycemic episodes. So that's going to be our priority, is always hypoglycemia. After that, we're going to check for glucose variability. So we're going to see, do we have a lot of glucose variability? Is it moderate? Is it very low? So we can evaluate that by looking at the range of our 25th to 75th and our 10th and 90th percentile. So those dark blue and light blue zones. And finally, we're going to use the median to give us an idea of our trends. Do we see any significant trends of glucose throughout the day, glucose levels throughout the day that will give us an indicator of whether or not we need to maybe adjust our insulin. So right now we're going to go in a little more detail because I just gave you kind of the overview of those 3 steps, but there's a tool that exists on Better that really explains every step one by one on how to proceed. And you can find it in the tools section, and it's called How to Analyze the AGP. So first step is hypoglycemia. So how do we evaluate hypoglycemia? So remember when I said there's some key data? Well, part of the key data is the time that you spent in hypoglycemia. You're going to have a number on that report, a percentage. And what we want to aim for is less than 4%. So you're going to look at that number. And then the second thing that you're going to do is you're going to draw that imaginary line at the 4 level. And you're going to see on your report, on the graphic there, and you're going to see, does the line of the 25th or the 10th percentile, does it touch a zone's hypoglycemic area during your 24-hour period? So is there a place are there certain periods of time during the day where you have more hypoglycemia? So if you look at this report, you can tell that maybe between 6 and midnight, you can see that the line of the 10th and the 50th percentile, or the 10th and the 25th percentile, is close to the hypozone, is sometimes touching the hypozone. So that gives us an indicator. That's a period where I have more hypo. So a few words with hypoglycemia and CGMs. Just a few reminders on how to deal with hypoglycemia. With the CGM technology, try to put a threshold that is a little higher. So don't put your threshold at 3.9 because first of all, around hypoglycemia, the CGM tends to be less precise, especially if your blood glucose is fluctuating very rapidly. But also there's that little delay. So if you put your threshold a little bit higher, it can help you prevent rather than treat hypoglycemia. So that's our kind of the key of trying to prevent instead of waiting till it happens and then you have to treat it and you're, giving a stress to your body of going through those symptoms. And then if you see in your report that your percentage of time that you spend in hypoglycemia is above 4%, that would be also an indicator. Be like, that's a little too much. What can we do? I need to talk to my team about this. Also, the opposite, if on your report there's 0% of hypoglycemia or maybe 1% of hypoglycemia, but you feel like you're constantly doing things to prevent hypoglycemia, so you're constantly eating at times that are not at meal times and not times that you're hungry, you're constantly avoiding activities to prevent hypoglycemia, you're not doing any sports, for example, then that would also be an indicator. Be like, oh, well, there's something that maybe we can adjust to with your treatment to make sure that you're not in this kind of rut of always trying to prevent. And finally, I always encourage patients to take their capillary blood glucose measurements more often around hypoglycemia. And the reason is, as I said, because of that delay, because that margin of error when you're in hypoglycemia is so little for it to really make a difference in the decision you're going to make. It's important to take a blood glucose measurement with the glucometer if you have a doubt whether you're in hypoglycemia, or after you treat a HYPO and it takes a while for it to go up, it's a good time to take a capillary blood glucose level just to make sure that you're above the 4 range and you're not going to overtreat. Because it could take up to 30 to 45 minutes with that delay for your CGM to really indicate that you're at 4 or above. So I'd say during this time, sometimes you can look more at your trend arrow and also be a little more patient, take a blood glucose measurement in case you're in doubt. Because again, around that time, it's a little less precise. So it's important to be careful. So our second step is variability in our PGA report. So we're really going to look at the different, the variability of the glucose, so that the zones of the 25th to 75th percentile and the 10th to 90th percentile, and see how large it is. But the other data metric or glucose metric that's going to help you is the coefficient of variation. So we want to aim for less than 36%. And here is an example of 2 reports where the first one we have very little variability. So we see our CV, our coefficient of variation, is 17%. And the second one, we have a lot more variability, and you can see it, and our CV reflects this, and it's 38%. So when you have a lot of variability, usually we want to go and look at the daily journal of your glucose values, your glucose profile, in order to see trends, because when it's very variable like that, it's going to be more difficult to really establish some trends. So variability is pretty much the tricky one, and it's always hard to reduce variability because there's so many factors that affect blood sugar, and there's so many factors that can cause variability. So that's where you're going to it's going to take a little more time, a little more effort to really look at the day-to-day and what are your activities, what are you doing to cause really that big variability of glucose from day to day. So in the tool that I just mentioned on Better, on the flip side of the tool, you're going to see that there's a list of all these different questions and all these different factors to think about that can cause the variability. And I really encourage you to go and look at it, because it can give you ideas, and it can also help you create some discussion points with your healthcare team. Finally, if you don't have too much variability, what we can look at are the trends. So we're really going to look at that median line, and we're going to follow it and see what are my trends. Are there periods where my blood glucose is always going up, always going down? What we're aiming for is a flat line, but we know that that's pretty much impossible, but we want it to be, you know, as consistent as we can. And and once we know our trends, then it's going to be easier to make certain adjustments. So as I said, with low variability, there's clear trends, then we can adjust insulin, and it's going to be usually effective. So we're going to finish off by looking at 2 examples with 2 reports and practice this analysis using the 3-step model of analyzing the AGP. So the first example that we have here is Patrick. And if we look at his AGP report, we're going to look at some of the key data or the key metrics that it's giving us. So we know that we're looking at 14 days of data. We know that the percentage of time that the sensor is active, so the percentage of data that we have in this report is 91%, so that's good. We can see that our glucose variability, the CV is 31.7%, which is moderate. We're going to come back to that. But if we go through our step-by-step process, the first thing we really want to look at is hypoglycemia. So the first step is to look at our percentage of time spent in hypoglycemia, and you can see at the bottom right that it's 0%. And if we look at the report and the AGP, if you look at the zone of hypoglycemia, we see that the 10th and 25th percentile line does not touch the hypoglycemia zone. So it's true, there is no hypoglycemia in this report. The second part is looking at the variability. So as I said, the glucose variability here is moderate. We have that a CV of 31.7%. We know the recommendation is to stay under 36%. So let's say the variability is moderate, but we can really look at, you know, certain zones throughout the day. Are there certain times where it's more variable than others? And you can see that during the night, it's pretty variable. And then third, we're going to look at the trends. So we're going to follow our median line. We can see that there are certain trends that are clear. You can see that there's a trend where between midnight and 9 in the morning, the blood glucose is going down. And then we have upward trends, most likely after meals, which is between 9 and noon and around 6 p.m. Until about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And finally, just to highlight also the time and range, which is important. As I said, we want to look at the time that we spent in our targets. So if we look at the target range, you know, it's always between 4 and 10 millimole per liter. On the bottom right, we can see that Patrick spends 41% of the time in this target range, which is below the recommendation. So if you remember, what we recommend is 70% of time in range. So for Patrick, if we look at these 3 steps, the first one, we always prioritize hypoglycemia. There's none, so that is not an issue. However, we do see that there is some variability, glycemic variability. It's not too much, but we still want to try to understand. And here I said, you know, let's try to understand why is it so variable at night? Because usually during the night is the period where we're sleeping and there's less variability. So that could be like one thing that we can look at is why is it variable at night? And then finally, looking at the trends, we saw that there's multiple trends, but we do see that there is a trend of blood glucose levels going up post meals. So there's quite a few things that Patrick can discuss with his healthcare team and kind of have a reflection on reviewing his behaviors and also his insulin doses for his meals, reviewing his meals with the nutritionist, trying to identify the cause of variability at nighttime. But for him, what we really want to increase is his time in range, right? So it's 41%, but we would like to slowly increase that and make sure that as we increase the time in range, we're not causing more hypoglycemia. So for Patrick, he can, have a look at and have quite a few points to discuss with his healthcare team, and looking ahead of time and seeing what his blood glucose profile looks like and what his trends are. So finally, we're going to end with Jessica. And for Jessica, we have also a lot of data on her report, 99% of the data, so that's good. It's over 14 days that we're looking at the report. That's also going to be important. The glucose variability is moderate to high, so 35.5%. It's right under that 36% range. But if we go through the steps with her, the first thing that we see is too much time spent in hypoglycemia. So if we look at her report, we see that 7% of the time is hypoglycemia, and we recommend under 4%. So that's too much. And if we look at her AGP profile, and we look at the hypoglycemic zone in red on the bottom left of the screen, we can see that the 10th and 25th percentile line sometimes touches the 4 level, and especially, and it's kind of throughout the day, but especially we see that there's a trend during the night. So between maybe after dinner, like around 7 p.m. and 10 p.m., we see that there's probably a period, a zone where there's more hypoglycemia. The second thing that we want to look at is the variability. So as I said, it's moderate, 35.5%. Maybe sometimes a little bit more during the night, but I'd say when I look at this report, it seems fairly consistent throughout the day. There's not necessarily one area where there's more variability. And finally, if we look at the trends, so we're going to look at our median line, the dark blue line, and there's a few trends, but the ones that I would be the most concerned about are those downward trends. So the downward trend between 9 and 12 and between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. Because those downward trends, you can see that at the bottom of the hill there, those are the zones where she's most at risk for hypoglycemia. So we need to understand, why is it going down so much, maybe a little too fast and maybe a little too much. So for Jessica, what we really need to address and what she can address with her healthcare team is the frequency of hypoglycemia. So we really want to decrease that percentage of time spent in hypoglycemia. Her variability is moderate. Her CV stays below 36%, but she's limited. So we want to make sure that we keep that variability there and that we're not going to increase it. And finally, for the trends, as I said, I think that downward trends are really the trends that we're going to focus on to see those zones that are risk for hypoglycemia. So what she's really going to want to try to identify, and what she can do using the tool, and maybe looking at the different factors too for hypoglycemia on the back of the tool, is question yourself, what are my main causes of hypoglycemia? When are they happening throughout my day? On my HYPO report, I can see that it's mostly after dinner time. If I go on my daily report, do I still see that trend? So those are things that Jessica can kind of do, maybe as homework per se, before she goes and sees her healthcare team. Or if she feels confident enough, she can also maybe adjust a few things herself. So to conclude, just I want to say that we can see that the CGM technology is very useful, has a lot of advantages for managing blood glucose levels, but also for having good follow-up and good care with our healthcare team. The reports are really easily accessible, so I really encourage you to go and look at them sometimes to help you with your blood glucose control and management on a daily basis. So all the key data and the clinical recommendations that I showed to you with the time and range, with the CV value, with the HbA1c indicator, those are all numbers that really give us a standard of practice and kind of like a guideline that we use as clinicians. But I just wanted to also remind you that, you know, if you're seeing this and you're like, oh my God, I don't have those numbers, it doesn't mean you have poor control. It means that, first of all, we need to see what your situation is, and that's really up to the healthcare provider to determine if you really need to follow those numbers or not. It's individualized. Every diabetes in person is unique, but it is true that for the general population, for most people, we're going to aim for those numbers. And why do we aim for those numbers is because what the literature and what the research shows is that if we're able to attain those numbers, it's going to protect us from having complications related to our diabetes later. So they're not just numbers that exist out of nowhere. They're really related to health and minimizing complications later down the road. Also, last thing is just a reminder to take your blood glucose, your capillary blood glucose value if you ever have a doubt with your CGM. And just remember that around those periods, sports, around HYPO, those are the times where the CGM can be a little less precise. So you need to really understand that in order to utilize it the right way. And it doesn't hurt to take a capillary blood glucose test once in a while. Finally, as you can see with those 3 steps that we looked how to analyze the ADP report, I'd say the glycemic variability is really the hardest, most difficult thing to tackle. But the way that you can be prepared and how you can help minimize that glycemic variability is really to choose maybe a week or 2-week period where you're going to try to put in as much information, as much data in your CGM. So most CGMs you can write down when you eat. You can even write how many grams of glucose, sugar that you ingest, carbs. You can also write down when you exercise. And the more data you can add in those reports, it's going to help your healthcare team and professionals to help you understand why there's variability and what we can change, whether it's insulin, the insulin dose, or maybe it's really just behaviors or strategies around blood glucose management. So that pretty much wraps up the webinar for today. I'm going to take some time just to answer to questions if we have any. So thank you so much for your attention. Just going to stop this. Oh. Okay. So it looks like we do not have any questions. I will maybe wait just a few minutes, but otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for tuning in today. Oh, I have a general CGM question. I'd heard anecdotally that inserting the sensor helps accuracy for the first day. Technically, it's kind of true, because what happens is that the reason why the sensor is not as precise the first 24 hours is because it's this foreign agent in your body, and it takes a while for your body to kind of get used to it. So that's why it's not as sensitive the first 24 hours. We did used to say that for the freestyle, you can, put in a new sensor a few days before, and then you activate it once the other one is finished. You can do that. I did hear that with the Libre 2, they've kind of worked on that as well. So it's supposedly it's as accurate the first days. But with the Libre, the first version, I think that does help. Okay, great. So thank you so much, and I wish you all a great day.